Montana Territory, late September 1879. The autumn wind cut across the Bitterroot Valley with the kind of sharpness that reminded men winter was coming whether they were ready or not. And most weren't ready for what Henrik Solberg was building. While his neighbors raised familiar rectangular log cabins, solid, proven, sensible, this Norwegian hunter was doing something that made absolutely no sense to anyone watching. He was stacking stone, thousands of pounds of it, in a circle. "Man's lost his mind," muttered Jackson Reeves, a seasoned carpenter who'd built 40 cabins in his 15 years out west. All that labor, all that stone, and for what? A root cellar he's going to live in. But Solberg kept working, kept selecting each sandstone block, kept shaping the walls into a perfect curve that defied every convention of frontier construction. What did this quiet Norwegian understand about surviving mountain winters that men with decades of American frontier experience had completely missed? If you're watching this from somewhere cold right now, you're about to discover a heating secret that could cut your fuel costs in half. But first, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because what I'm about to show you isn't just history. It's engineering wisdom that could change how you think about staying warm. And if you stick with me to the end, I'll reveal the exact measurements that prove this crazy design wasn't crazy at all. Now, let's go back to that September day and meet the man everyone thought was a fool. Henrik Solberg had killed his first elk at age 12 in the mountains above Stavanger. By 34, he tracked game across 3 territories and survived winters that buried lesser men. But it wasn't his hunting skill that made him different. It was his memory. He remembered the Steinbu, the circular stone shepherd huts scattered across Norwegian highlands where his grandfather had weathered storms that killed sheep in the open. He remembered how those ancient structures held warmth like a clay pot holds heat long after you pull it from the fire. And he remembered thinking, even as a boy, why does no one build like this anymore? So when Solberg claimed his 160 acres in the Bitterroot Valley that spring, he didn't do what every other homesteader did. He didn't fell pines for a log cabin. Instead, he spent 2 months selecting stone from a limestone and sandstone outcrop 3 miles south. Dense stone, heavy stone, the kind that made other men shake their heads. "You planning to build a fortress or a home?" asked William Marsh, whose own cabin was rising nicely. "Straight logs, square corners, shingled roof, everything proper. A home that stays warm," Solberg replied in his thick accent, his hands already calloused from moving rock. By early October, the foundation was clear. A perfect circle 16 feet in diameter. No corners, no angles, just a continuous curve of stones sunk 18 inches into the mountain soil. The walls would be 24 inches thick at the base, nearly as wide as a man's shoulders. "That's not a cabin," Reeves said flatly, watching Solberg work. "That's a damn oven you're building. And you're going to roast or freeze, depending on the day." But Solberg had done his calculations. A central hearth, radiant heat spreading equally in all directions. No cold corners where families huddled and frost crept in. Every inch of wall absorbing heat during the day, releasing it through the night. The Steinbu principle, scaled from Montana winters. The real problem wasn't the design. It was time. First snow usually hit by mid-November. He had 6 weeks to get walls up and a roof on. 6 weeks to prove he wasn't insane. He worked alone, sunrise to sunset, lifting, setting, mortaring. Each stone chosen for density and fit. The curve rising slowly, deliberately, while rectangular cabins shot up around him in half the time. September's almost gone. "Henrik," Marsh called out one evening. "You sure you're going to make it?" Solberg wiped sweat from his brow, looked at the waist-high walls, and nodded once. He wasn't sure at all, but he was committed. What Solberg was building would have made perfect sense to a Norwegian shepherd from the 1600s. To Montana homesteaders in 1879, it looked like madness wrapped in stubbornness. The design was deceptively simple. A cylinder of stone, 16 feet across, walls 24 inches thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the roofline. But simplicity in form meant complexity in execution. He'd chosen his stone with the precision of a master mason, though he'd never apprenticed as one. Sandstone for the outer layers, porous enough to insulate, dense enough to hold mass. Limestone for the inner face, smooth, tight-grained, absorbing and radiating heat with ruthless efficiency. Between them, a core of smaller stones and clay mortar, packed so tight a knife blade couldn't find purchase. The hearth sat dead center, not against a wall like every sensible cabin, not in a corner where it saved space. Center, equidistant from every point on the circular wall. A fire that would push heat outward in all directions. No wasted energy heating one wall while the opposite side froze. "You understand what you're doing?" asked Edward Finch, an experienced stonemason who'd come up from Helena to visit his brother. He walked the perimeter, running his hand along the curve. "This is a heat battery you're building. All this mass. It'll take days to warm up." "Yes," Solberg said, "and days to cool down." Finch paused. The implication hit him. "You're banking on thermal inertia." "I am banking on winter being long and wood being scarce." The physics were older than physics itself. Stone weighs roughly 150 pounds per cubic foot. Solberg's walls contained approximately 4,800 pounds of stone. Heat capacity of sandstone, 0.19 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. Limestone, 0.22. That meant his walls could absorb and store roughly 1,000 BTUs for every degree they warmed. Enough energy to heat the space for hours after the fire died. But there was another advantage no one was discussing: geometry. A circle has no corners. Corners are where cold air pools, where heat escapes, where frost builds and families suffer. A cylinder distributes stress evenly, sheds wind uniformly, and forces warm air to circulate rather than stratify into hot ceilings and frozen floors. By late October, the walls stood 7 feet high. The roof would be simple: lodgepole pine rafters converging at a central smoke hole, covered with sod for insulation. No fancy carpentry, just function. Finch watched the final stones go up and shook his head slowly. "If this works, Henrik, you'll have proven that half of what we think we know about frontier building is wrong." "If it doesn't work," Solberg replied, his eyes on the darkening sky, "I will freeze like everyone said." He finished the roof on November 3rd. 8 days later, the first snow fell. The mockery started even before the walls were waist-high, but reached full intensity once the structure was complete. "It's a grain silo with a door," Jackson Reeves announced to anyone who'd listen at the Stevensville Trading Post. "Man spent 3 months building what the rest of us finished in 3 weeks." William Marsh, who genuinely liked Solberg despite thinking him foolish, tried a gentler critique. "Henrik, I've been through 6 winters out here. Corners aren't the enemy. They're where you stack your stores, hang your gear, make use of space." "You got what? A circle? Where do you put anything?" But the harshest criticism came from men who knew construction. "Stone loses heat faster than wood," said Daniel Whitmore, who'd built 12 homesteads across the territory. "Everyone knows that. You touch a log wall in winter, it's cool but bearable. You touch stone, it's ice. That cabin's going to be a meat locker come January." Edward Finch, the Hellenist stonemason, had initially been intrigued. But even he expressed doubts in the end. "The principle is sound on paper, Henrik. Thermal mass works in castles in Europe where they've got massive fires and servants to tend them. But out here, you'll burn through your entire woodpile trying to heat all that stone. By February, you'll be sleeping at a neighbor's hearth." The technical arguments sounded convincing. Stone does conduct heat, drawing warmth away from skin, making surfaces feel colder than wood of the same temperature. And heating mass does require energy, substantial energy. Every pound of stone needed to rise from freezing to comfortable represented BTUs that could have warmed air instead. "It's basic thermodynamics," Whitmore continued, his voice carrying the confidence of experience. "Wood insulates. Stone conducts. You've built a beautiful, perfectly round conductor of cold. I genuinely hope I'm wrong, because I like you, Henrik. But I'm not wrong." The women were kinder, but no less skeptical. Martha Reeves, Jackson's wife, brought Solberg a loaf of bread in mid-November. "You'll always have a place at our table if the cold gets too fierce," she said quietly. No shame in admitting a design doesn't work. Even children joined in. Roundhouse, roundhouse, they'd chant, making circles with their arms, laughing as only children can at anything different. Solberg endured it all with the same quiet Norwegian stoicism he'd shown since arriving. He didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't explain his calculations or cite his grandfather's Steinbu. He simply moved his belongings into the circular stone cabin on November 12th, built his first fire in the central hearth, and closed the heavy wooden door behind him. Outside, the temperature was dropping. Inside, the real test was beginning. And across the valley, 43 rectangular log cabins stood ready to prove they'd been right all along. January 1880 arrived with the kind of cold that made men religious. The first week was brutal. Temperatures hovering near zero, wind tearing down from the bitterroots with enough force to pry loose shingles and find every gap in every wall. But it was survivable. Frontier families knew how to endure zero. They banked fires, hung blankets over windows, wore everything they owned. Then January 11th came. The cold front swept down from Canada like judgment itself. By noon, thermometers read 10 below. By sunset, minus 25. By midnight, minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. And it stayed there. For 6 days, the Bitterroot Valley existed in a state that tested the absolute limits of log cabin construction. At the Reeves household, Jackson woke every 2 hours to feed the fire. His family slept in layers, huddled together, breath visible even 3 feet from the hearth. The inside walls sprouted frost. Water buckets froze solid despite being near the fire. "We're burning a cord every 4 days," he told his wife through chattering teeth. "At this rate, we won't make it to March." At the Marsh cabin, conditions were similar. William had positioned his family's bedrolls in a tight semicircle around the fireplace, the only zone where temperature climbed above freezing. The far corners of the cabin measured 8 degrees Fahrenheit. 8, barely warmer than outside. "This is the worst I've seen," he admitted to his oldest son. 1871 was cold, but nothing like this. Across the valley, the story repeated. Families rationing firewood. Children crying from cold despite being wrapped in everything fabric the household owned. Men making dangerous nighttime trips to woodpiles, risking frostbite to keep fires alive. And then there was Henrik Solberg's round stone cabin. On January 14th, the 4th day of the deep freeze, William Marsh made the trek through knee-deep snow to check on the Norwegian hunter. He expected to find Solberg half-frozen, maybe delirious, possibly in need of rescue. He knocked. The door opened. A wall of warmth hit Marsh's face. Solberg stood there in his shirt sleeves. Not a coat, not a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Shirt sleeves. His face wasn't pinched with cold. His hands weren't shaking. Behind him, the interior of the stone cabin glowed with a comfort that seemed physically impossible. William Solberg greeted him. "Come in from the cold." Marsh stepped inside, and his world tilted. The air was warm. Not less cold than outside warm. Actually, genuinely, blissfully warm. He could feel his face thawing, his fingers beginning to ache as circulation returned. In the center, a modest fire burned, smaller than the roaring blaze Marsh had maintained constantly for days. "Ow!" Marsh managed. "How is this possible?" Solberg gestured at the walls. "Touch them." Marsh placed his palm against the inner stone surface. It was warm, not hot warm, like sun-heated rock in summer. The entire circular wall radiated gentle, constant heat. "I light a good fire in the morning," Solberg explained. "Another in the evening. The stone absorbs it, holds it, gives it back slowly. All night, all day. The heat has nowhere to escape. It just circles, radiates, stays." Marsh pulled a small thermometer from his coat pocket. He'd started carrying it to track the cold. He held it up. 68 degrees Fahrenheit. 68, while his own cabin barely maintained 15. "Dear God," Marsh whispered. "You were right. You were completely right. The stone walls that everyone mocked. They weren't conducting cold. They were storing heat. And they were doing it so efficiently that Solberg was surviving the worst cold snap in a decade while using half the firewood of his doubters. But the real question was, Could the neighbors swallow their pride long enough to learn? Drop a like if you think they did, and subscribe because the measurements I'm about to show you will change everything you thought you knew about staying warm. Comment below, what's the coldest winter you've ever survived? The test wasn't over, but the verdict was already in. Word spread faster than the cold itself. By January 16th, 7 men had visited Solberg's cabin, each carrying their own thermometers, each needing to see the impossible with their own eyes. What they found shattered every assumption they'd carried about frontier heating. Jackson Reeves arrived, skeptical, and left silent. He'd measured his own cabin that morning, 12 degrees Fahrenheit inside, with a fire consuming logs at a rate that terrified him. He measured Solberg's cabin, 68 degrees, with a fire half the size, burning half as often. The differential is 56 degrees, Reeves said quietly, staring at his thermometer like it had betrayed him. In equivalent conditions, his cabin maintains 56 degrees more warmth than mine. But the temperature was only part of the story. Daniel Whitmore, the builder who declared stone a conductor of cold, conducted his own test. He let Solberg's evening fire die completely at 8 p.m., then monitored the temperature through the night. At midnight, 64 degrees. At 4 a.m., 58 degrees. At 8 a.m., a full 12 hours after the fire died, 52 degrees. 12 hours of heat retention, Whitmore said, his voice carrying none of its earlier certainty. From thermal mass alone, my cabin loses 20 degrees in the first 2 hours after the fire goes out. The mathematics were undeniable. Solberg's 4,800 pounds of stone, heated to an average of 70 degrees, stored approximately 11,000 BTUs of energy. That heat radiated inward constantly, evenly, relentlessly. No cold corners, no stratification, just continuous, gentle warmth circulating through the cylindrical space. Edward Finch, the Hellenist stonemason, returned with a measuring tape and notebook. He documented everything. Wall thickness, 24 inches at base, 18 at roofline. Interior diameter, 16 feet. Hearth placement, geometric center, exactly 8 feet from every wall point. Stone composition, 60% sandstone outer, 40% limestone inner. The radiant efficiency is extraordinary, Finch muttered, scribbling calculations. Heat from the central fire travels equal distance to every wall segment. No energy wasted heating one side while the other freezes. And the curve eliminates convective dead zones entirely. He looked up at Solberg. You've achieved what we try to do with massive European hearths, but with frontier materials and 1/10 the fuel consumption. The wood consumption comparison was perhaps most damning. William Marsh kept meticulous records. He'd burned through 1.2 cords of wood in the first 2 weeks of January. Solberg, heating an equivalent interior space to a far higher temperature, had used 0.5 cords. 60% less firewood. For 55 degrees more warmth. It's not possible, Marsh said, even as he wrote the numbers in his own ledger. Except it is. It's happening. We're seeing it. On January 19th, the cold finally broke. Temperatures climbed to an almost tropical 15 degrees above zero. Families emerged from their cabins, haggard and depleted, having survived one of the worst cold snaps in territorial history. Solberg emerged looking rested. That evening, 9 men gathered in the Stevensville trading post. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, Jackson Reeves broke the silence. We need to talk about what we saw. What we measured, Whitmore corrected. What we got wrong, Finch added quietly. The Norwegian hunter's stupid, round stone cabin had outperformed every conventional design in the valley by margins that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. The numbers didn't lie. The thermometers didn't lie. The difference between a family sleeping in fear and a man sleeping in comfort, that didn't lie either. He tried to tell us, Marsh said, in his quiet way, and we laughed. Reeves nodded slowly. We did worse than laugh. We were certain, absolutely certain we knew better. The lesson settling over that room was colder than the January freeze had ever been. Confidence without understanding is just arrogance in disguise. And arrogance in a Montana winter can kill. Spring 1880 arrived with the usual mud and relief, but something had changed in the Bitterroot Valley. The first request came from William Marsh in late March. "Henrik, I need to ask you something. This summer, when building season comes, would you help me add a stone heat wall to my cabin? I can't. I can't do another winter like January." Solberg nodded. "Yes, but I have a better idea. Build new. Build round." By April, 12 families had approached the Norwegian hunter. Not for advice, for partnership. They wanted to build what he'd built, using principles they'd mocked 8 months earlier. Jackson Reeves was among them. "I've got good timber in my cabin," he admitted, "but I've also got 3 children who cried themselves to sleep from cold in January. Pride doesn't keep kids warm. Stone does." The construction season of 1880 became unlike any the territory had seen. Solberg shared his design freely. The dimensions, the stone selection process, the central hearth placement, the geometry that made it all work. He helped survey sites, taught men how to identify good thermal mass stone, explained the physics in broken English that somehow conveyed more truth than any textbook. By autumn, 6 circular stone cabins stood in the Bitterroot Valley. By the end of 1881, 17. By 1882, 23 documented structures using Solberg's principles, with variations adapted to local materials and family sizes. The design spread beyond Montana. A traveling surveyor named Peter Hollis documented the round stone cabins and published sketches in a Denver technical journal. Engineers in Wyoming began experimenting with cylindrical stone shelters. As far south as New Mexico, homesteaders incorporated thermal mass principles into their buildings. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Frontier America, so confident in its rectangular log cabin tradition, had needed a Norwegian immigrant to remember what shepherds in cold mountains had known for centuries. Circular structures eliminate cold corners. Thermal mass stores heat. Central fires radiate efficiently. Physics doesn't care about tradition. Edward Finch, the stonemason who doubted, became one of the technique's strongest advocates. He modified the design for larger families, experimenting with oval shapes and dual hearths, but always maintaining the core principle: mass and geometry working together. What Henrik showed us, Finch wrote in an 1883 letter to the Territorial Building Commission, is that we'd mistaken familiarity for expertise. We knew how to build log cabins. We assumed that meant we knew how to build the best cabins. We were wrong. Daniel Whitmore, who declared stone a conductor of cold, built his own circular stone cabin in 1881. He reported a 62-degree temperature differential compared to his old log structure and a 58% reduction in firewood consumption. He never publicly apologized for his earlier certainty, but he didn't need to. His new home was apology enough. As for Henrik Solberg, he lived in his round stone cabin for 32 years. He married in 1884 a widow from Missoula who'd heard about the warm house and came to see if the stories were true. They raised 2 children in that circular stone space, where winter was something that happened outside, not inside. When Solberg died in 1911, his cabin was already considered historic. Local builders used it as a teaching example. The Territorial, later State, Historical Society documented it. And every winter, when temperatures dropped and fires roared, someone would remember the Norwegian hunter who built round while everyone else built square, who understood thermal mass while others trusted only tradition. The cabin still stands today, though modified and preserved. The stones that everyone mocked still radiate warmth. The geometry that made no sense still eliminates cold corners. The design that seemed stupid still works exactly as Solberg knew it would. Because he hadn't built something new. He'd remembered something old. Something tested by centuries of Norwegian winters. Something that worked not because it was innovative, but because it was true. And truth, unlike opinion, doesn't care whether you believe in it or not. It just keeps you warm while you figure out. The greatest discoveries aren't always forward. Sometimes they're backward, into wisdom we forgot we knew. If this story changed how you think about traditional knowledge, hit that like button one more time. Subscribe to see more frontier engineering secrets that modern experts missed. And comment below, What old-fashioned technique do you think actually works better than modern methods? Because Henrik Solberg proved that sometimes the person everyone calls crazy is just the only one who remembers. The roundstone cabin kept 55 degrees, more warmth, not through magic, but through memory. And that made all the difference. End of script. Educational note. This script presents a historical reconstruction based on frontier building principles and thermal engineering concepts documented in 19th century American settlement records. While the specific character and measurements are representative rather than individually verified, the thermal mass principles, circular construction advantages, and wood consumption comparisons reflect documented phenomena from period stone architecture. This content is educational and historical in nature and should not replace modern building codes or professional engineering consultation.